The chapter name, The Climb, comes from a community workshop map I built for Portal 2. Well, it's actually 2 maps, which were built for a mapping competition. The theme was towering, and I interpreted it by letting you climb from the bottom layers of Aperture to the surface. Well, almost. At the end of Part 2, the screen fades to black with the text saying, Part 3 coming soon. Maybe. I never made Part 3. I won that competition, and it really kicked me into gear because those 2 maps were actually far more fun to play and had much more substance than the entirety of Portal Revolution at the time, which was 3 years into development at that point. And I built it in only 2 weeks. This and the previous chapter both act as a reimagining and tribute to the original Climb. I never made Part 3, but I finished this massive mod instead.
Here we are!
For this track, I began to introduce more elements that kind of sound like voices. The scraping sound in the background of this track was chosen because it kind of sounds like something is wailing in distress, some sort of apparition. The soft, distorted synth near the end of this track is actually a piano with a bunch of effects layered over it.
This was the first wooden map we built. It was inspired by a CSGO co-op campaign where you would discover an underground training area built out of wood. We wanted the test chambers to transition from primitive constructions made of cheap materials into more solid and expensive metal structures like seen in Portal 2. So that's what we did. This plastic tarp was made using a cloth simulation in Blender. That's all I really have to say about this. It looks cool. This map went through so many iterations. It was originally placed at the beginning of the previous chapter, but has been pushed further and further back. It's the first time the player sees the spire from below. At first the player would come here before having met Conley. We would have had to make another dramatic spire eruption scene for Conley to witness. That map was even prototyped, but it became obvious that the chapter's intro was too long, so we moved the eruption to happen after you have already met Conley. This cave was loosely modeled after the little town ports I frequented on vacations in Croatia. The giant pipe here resembles a wave protection barrier, and there are even some weird concrete buoys next to it with blue lights. While this cave doesn't resemble a small town in Croatia in any way, it's always fun to transform real-life inspiration into abstract Aperture structures. I like to play with the contrast of room shapes. This cave is wide and short, next to a tall and narrow shaft. This cave here serves no gameplay purpose, but helps to make the world feel larger and more connected. You can see where you will go, and can then look back to where you have been. These dark offices were recycled from some cut geometry. All the way back we wanted to have a large hall with many booths for something like a science fair. We imagined that, after Cave Johnson's death, Aperture ran a competition to come up with new products. The winning elements were the ones seen in Portal 2, like lasers, tractor beams and light bridges. And the losers never went to market. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to really explore that idea in this area. The only remnant is a whiteboard drawing about these light bridges. How do you get players to look at your set piece? This was a big struggle for us here.
Whoa.
The rock geometry above you used to extrude out much further, which blocked the view a lot more. We did this to open up the cavern towards the end of the walkway. We wanted players to walk forward and look up to reveal the grand cavern. This didn't happen. Nobody even noticed that anything was happening. They just stared at the sand. So we opened up the view, but players still didn't look. It's well known that players never look up in 3D games. To help fix this, we added the staircase and played the sequence right as you're likely to have looked up, where the spire is now perfectly framed. That helped to get players to notice that something was happening, but players would then immediately walk past to the shore and not notice anything was going on. Those are the sorts of moments where you just want to strangle your playtester, when they would hear the music and sound effects while staring at the sand and just ask, "What's up with the sound here?" So eventually we took out the big hammer and just blocked the player from getting onto the sand until the scene is done. We also added Conley to the scene and gave her some lines, which definitely helped to prompt players to look at the thing their companion is talking about.
Originally, the theme of the spire was supposed to play here, but now the only remnants of it playing here is the big music stinger during the earthquake. The reason for its removal from this scene is because it was a bit too intense and felt out of place. In its stead, I made an ominous track that has elements from the Spire theme, but not the main, Spire melody.
This map has actually existed before we came up with the Spire. The cylinder in front of you was just a random silo that you would have to climb. During a story rewrite in 2019, this silo then inspired the geometry of the spire. We added a lot more to it since, but the general layout has stayed pretty much the same all the way through.
Does digital cameras count?
We like the idea of letting players climb up inside the spire. Down here it's just a bunch of pipes that all transport stuff to the core at the top. The shaft becomes wider and wider as it goes up, stealing more and more resources from the surroundings. It goes from the bottommost layers all the way up to the surface. You just came from the tip of the top, and now you're all the way down.
I want to research this spire thing while you
When this
solve the
map was
dreams.
redesigned to use a pushing vac tube instead of a sucking one, we needed to make a new entrance for it. So that whole behind the scenes section and fake test chamber was made to serve as a transition between the lower section of Aperture to the slightly more modern area of Aperture.
So far, vacuum tubes have only pulled, but now they can also push. We were shuffling around chambers and ended up putting this chamber right after the player entered the vacuum tube in the previous map. It all came together. We could now have you exit through the very same vacuum tube that is now part of the puzzle. This also subtly introduces that this tube pushes, it doesn't suck. In the anniversary update, we expanded this puzzle by adding another step for completion. You need to use the cube pushing mechanic one more time to solve the puzzle. This chamber kept growing and evolving a lot over time. In the beginning, there was only the upper area built to play what we call vac tube basketball. There used to be an actual basket to catch the ball with, but the fling was so accurate that it wasn't needed. That used to be the entire puzzle, and you could still see the old exit hallway. We felt that this was too short and hardly a puzzle. All you had to do was push a button, not a single portal was placed. So we took another look at the area and found a way to incorporate the new gel flow mechanic. We like building chambers that evolve and change. They're not always easy to design, but the payoff is great. We can save some time decorating an entirely new space, and the density is greatly felt by players.
I had a lot of fun with this one, since industrial found sound is more my wheelhouse. I wanted the track to sound like some sort of mechanical process, like some sort of factory machinery going through the motions. This particular track features the sound of steam flowing through a pipe and something metallic being scraped and slammed repeatedly. The large metallic slam, I believe, is either from a dumpster or a large pipe. I can't quite remember the specifics as of writing this.
This detail, with part of the facility being flooded, came about when I saw a vac tube in this level going into the water. It gave me a great idea on how to detail this section and apply the response more to this lower area than simply a moat.
One feature we added to the Revolution engine, and I've also ported back to P2C, is the smooth gel flow you see here. The debug visualization shows all the segments created along the path. I started to implement the object following mechanic myself when I realized that tractor beams already did exactly what I needed. These segments are now a bunch of tractor beam triggers made to be invisible and silent. Gel doesn't behave like normal physics entities and requires a lot more custom code to move it precisely, so I was happy to reuse logic that was already proven to work. We sometimes design these behind-the-scenes puzzles with multiple solutions in mind. It's not about finding the one pre-built path, but about making your own. Here you can use the blue gel to bounce back up, or the orange gel to speed over. During playtests, players will almost always express a sense of accomplishment when they solve a puzzle in an unintended way. Of course, we fix exploits in proper puzzles, but like to give players some more freedom every now and then.
Test subject.
The trajectory of gels gets bent by vac tubes. We call this gel bending. It's a fun interaction, but because of the static nature of vac tubes, not actually that easy to design chambers with. The bending can also be rather approximate and not strong enough to really make much of a difference, but we still try to make some puzzles with it. This puzzle can be solved in many ways, but the intended solution when I built it involves a double bounce on the floor surface and a rebound on the wall. A lot of playtesters used a much less involved solution, which I found incredibly unsatisfying. The double bounce is so much more fun, and I tried everything to remove the boring solution, but I couldn't find a fix. All my ideas required a lot of changes and bulky equipment, which detracted from the simplicity I aim for in puzzles. So without a fix in sight, we added these two achievements, the boring solution and the fun solution, to encourage players to attempt the puzzle in different ways. What was originally a compromise turned into quite a fun minigame for a lot of players.
I don't know if this is
As a
supposed to be
voice actor,
test
these
chamber.
lines are very relatable. No acting required.
Officially hit a new
What I
low.
actually wanted to talk about in this section was humour. Humour is a big part of the Portal series, and Stefan has a great nose for it. I had a lot of fun capturing the humour of Conley, doing those impressions of Cave and those silly giggles, and like I said earlier, it makes her feel more human. She's not funny in an idiot Wheatley way, she's goofy. She's trying to smile through what is objectively a bad situation. Like those lines in The Offices where she's talking about the conference room of danger. Humour is how she's learnt to cope with how unethical her job is, and I honestly find that really charming about her.
White gel is one of the hardest elements to design puzzles for. Most puzzle elements, like lasers, light bridges, and tractor beams, give the player temporary progression, since they can be switched on and off at any point. They can also have positive and negative effects. A light bridge can act as a helpful platform or a barrier to cross. Puzzle difficulty is created by combining those effects to create interesting new interactions, which players need to spend time discovering. Now, gels are different. They almost always deliver permanent progression, since a painted surface is hardly less useful than an unpainted one. Sure, blue and orange surfaces can have negative effects, like disallowing cubes to rest on it, but in the case of white gel, I cannot think of a single downside to having a portable surface over a non-portable surface. We didn't yet crack the code of how to make hard and engaging puzzles with white gel, but we still wanted to feature it, so we built this explorative puzzle as a pacebreaker during this long chapter. This space is inspired by the Gasometer Cinema in Vienna. It's a crazy space that looks a lot like Aperture. A giant hall of cinema rooms stacked on top of each other, looking a lot like test chambers, connected through hanging metal catwalks. There's even a huge spiral staircase next to a pillar that goes all the way from the top to the bottom. The sense of verticality in this space is great. This area here was loosely built off that structure.
This one survived the test of time.
As Conley already said, this is a very old chamber. I designed this all the way back in 2018, and the puzzle has not changed a single bit ever since. It used to be the second puzzle in this chapter, but playtesters needed a lot more training to get a grip on the vacuum mechanic. So it's been shifted back more and more to where it is now, second to last. You can tell it's old, because it features a whopping 3 floor buttons. This chamber received a full visual overhaul throughout its development. During that, we added these little transition areas that let you walk around the outside areas of the chamber a bit. Gameplay-wise, there's no point to these. We could just have you enter the chamber right away, but we like to spend some time establishing the surroundings, the space between spaces, which are not a destination to themselves. In this case, it also helped to connect to the previous map where the player left the beaten path. In the anniversary update, we opened up this corner of the map a bit more. Before, the cube dropper was in its own little bubble off to the side, and players would often not find it for a very long time. You could see it pretty well from the observation room at the beginning. There were signs pointing towards it, and the catwalk flooring should also subtly lead you. But none of it was enough, so we decided to update this. Turns out the chamber didn't stand the test of time after all.
I believe this was one of the first of the original beta tracks I remastered. It was like the definitive one we were keeping for sure, since it was so iconic. And eventually other tracks followed suit, like Synthesis and Sunlight.
The visual design of this chamber dates way back to the first concepts of Portal Revolution. Usually I design chambers with a combination of gameplay elements, but here I started with a visual language and feeling. I wanted to play on vertigo and vastness. The chamber hangs precariously above the bottomless pit. To enter, you have to fling across the pit. In the vacuum ride, you place underneath the chamber with only glass separating you from the abyss. The final move in the chamber involves walking on a light bridge over the pit and removing it to fall onto a catapult and hopefully smash into the wall. Falling down onto the grate to smash off the pieces. There's a lot of elements that re-emphasize this theme, and while I don't know if players actually experience fear of heights in this map, I had a lot of fun finding and expanding on a concept like this.
Ah, such a cute squeal! Conley being afraid of heights just makes her feel so human. And her being afraid for the character on that jump and hearing her be worried makes her so likable. God, that scream though. Screaming is so hard to capture in VO because it just blows the levels on your mic, especially if you don't have top of the line equipment. It took quite a few takes and a bit of fiddling with the levels and a few lemon and honey teas, but it was worth it.
It is often surprising how strongly people sometimes react to a character's tone of voice. This dialogue used to be a bit more harsh towards the player. We felt like a reaction was a fitting reflection of Conley's intense second-hand fear of heights, but players consistently pointed out that this line was too mean and even noted that it makes Conley less likable, so we changed it out to be more lighthearted.
This is another remake of a beta track by Ella Ayar. This one was called Synthesis, and I kind of envision it as Conley's theme, but it's not used again after this chamber. I wish I got to play around with character themes more. The only sort of Sterling theme is in the cut Sterling and the Spire track, and it's not even the melody, it's just I relate the soft synth in that track to Sterling.